The midday sun beat down on the ancient cobblestones of the Capitol, casting long, sharp shadows from the wrought iron railings that lined the ceremonial route. A low, expectant hum filled the air, a river of sound made up of 1,000 whispered conversations. They had come from every corner of the country, these people, their faces a patchwork of ages and backgrounds, all united by a single purpose: to catch a glimpse of their monarch. They pressed against the barriers, a sea of colorful summer clothing and fluttering flags, their eyes fixed on the distant gates of the palace from where the procession would soon emerge. Among them, standing apart from the jostling crowd, was a man named Silas. He was a granite statue in a current of restless water. He didn't lean on the barrier like the others, nor did he crane his neck or shift his weight from foot to foot. He stood with an absolute stillness, a posture bred from years of an entirely different kind of patience. His hands, large and calloused, rested lightly on the top of the metal barricade, his knuckles bearing the faint white traces of old scars. His face, weathered and tanned, was a landscape of deep lines, not just of age, but of sun, wind, and squinting into distant, hostile horizons. A faded tattoo, the emblem of a famous airborne unit, was just visible on his forearm beneath the rolled-up sleeve of his plain chambray shirt. To the casual observer, Silas was just another older man, perhaps a farmer or a construction worker taking in the spectacle. But there was a quality to his presence that made the space immediately around him feel curiously empty, as it was a subtle aura of contained power, of vigilance. While the crowd saw a royal pageant, Silas, despite his best efforts, saw something else entirely. He saw a vast, open space. He saw choke points and fields of fire. He saw the rooftops opposite, assessing them as possible vantage points. He saw the clusters of police, noting their positioning and their fields of view. His eyes, a pale and startling blue, moved constantly, slowly, a quiet scan that had become as instinctive as breathing. The pomp and ceremony were a thin, brightly painted veneer over a reality his training would never let him forget. A crowd was a target, and an open street was a kill zone. 20 years had passed since he had worn a uniform, but the uniform had never truly come off. It was woven into the fabric of his being. He had been a master sergeant, at the backbone of an elite regiment, a man who had led younger soldiers through the gates of hell in dusty, forgotten places. He had seen the very worst of what humanity could do to itself. He had held dying boys in his arms and called in fire support on enemy positions. He had learned to read the subtle shifts in a crowd, the flicker of dangerous intent in a man's eyes 100 yards away. The memories were not ghosts that haunted him. They were steel rods that reinforced his skeleton. They had taught him that peace was an illusion, a fragile construct maintained by the constant, silent vigilance of men and women like he used to be. Today, he was simply trying to be a citizen. His daughter, a history teacher in the city, had encouraged him to come. "It's a piece of our living history, Dad," she had said. "A happy memory. Ah, you need more of those." He loved her for trying, for her persistent belief that he could be scrubbed clean of his past. So he had come, standing on the periphery, watching the living history unfold. He heard the distant blare of trumpets, a sound that in another life would have been a signal to move, to fight. Now, it was just music. He felt a slight loosening of the knot in his chest. Maybe she was right. Maybe this was nice. Then he saw him. It was a flicker of movement, but not the aimless shifting of the crowd. It was a deliberate, cutting motion. A young man, all sharp angles and restless energy, was pushing his way through the throng. He wasn't moving toward the front to get a better view. He was moving against the flow, his trajectory, an intersecting line that was aimed directly at a point just ahead of where Silas stood. The man was wiry, with a shaved head and a face contorted by a mixture of anger and bravado. His eyes weren't on the approaching procession. They were locked onto the line of mounted royal guards, resplendent in their gleaming breastplates and towering helmets of black horsehair. There was no admiration in that gaze, only a raw, seething hatred. Silas's entire body went rigid. The ambient noise of the crowd faded to a dull hum. His peripheral vision sharpened, and his focus narrowed to this single disruptive element. He saw the man's hand clenched into a fist, but it wasn't empty. Protruding from his grip was the dark, heavy shape of a short metal pipe, one of those used for temporary signage, now repurposed as a crude and brutal weapon. The man's intent was written on every line of his body. He wasn't just posturing. He was an assassin of the moment, a seeker of chaos, about to commit an act of stupendous violence and idiocy against a symbol of the state. The logic of it was irrelevant. The politics didn't matter. To Silas, there was only the threat. In a split second, his mind processed the variables: the distance to the man, the speed of his approach, the trajectory of his swing, the probable target, a young guardsman on a massive black horse, his attention fixed forward, utterly oblivious to the danger materializing at his flank. The officer represented everything Silas had once fought to protect: order, discipline, duty. He was a kid, probably no older than the fresh recruits Silas had once tried so desperately to keep alive. The sight of that ignorance to the oncoming threat was like a physical blow to Silas's gut. He wasn't just a spectator anymore. He was a sentry, and the perimeter was being breached. Without a conscious decision, his body took over. The years of training, the muscle memory etched into his very sinews, bypassed his civilian mind entirely. He didn't think. He reacted. He pushed off the barrier with a force that made the metal shudder, and the crowd parted instinctively before him, sensing the sudden, focused danger. He moved not with the jerky haste of panic, but with the fluid, explosive economy of a predator. He closed the gap in 5 silent, ground-eating strides, his eyes never leaving the thug's upraised arm. He saw the muscles in the man's shoulder bunch for the swing, saw the pipe begin its downward arc towards the guardsman's unprotected head. The crowd gasped, a few screams beginning to erupt, but they were already too late. The thug's moment of glory was about to be brutally, decisively curtailed. He had picked a fight not just with a symbol, but with a man who had forgotten more about violence than he would ever know. The world seemed to slow down for Silas, a phenomenon every combat veteran knows. The thug, whose name was Malachi, felt the heft of the pipe in his hand, the cool metal slick with his own sweat. The target was perfect: a guard, a puppet of the establishment, sitting high and proud on his horse. This was his moment. This was his chance to make a statement, to be someone. The rage that had been simmering in him for years, a toxic brew of perceived slights and internet-fed conspiracies, had finally found its focus. He saw the back of the guardsman's polished helmet, the vulnerable curve of his neck where it met the starched collar. He started his swing, a grunt of effort escaping his lips. The pipe never completed its arc. Just as his muscles reached the peak of their contraction, a force unlike anything he had ever felt slammed into his upper arm. It was as if he had been struck by a car. His swing was not just stopped, it was violently reversed. The pipe was ripped from his grasp, clattering uselessly onto the cobblestones. His own momentum, combined with the brutal, shocking force of the impact, spun him halfway around. His mind, flooded with adrenaline a moment before, was now a blank slate of confusion and searing pain. He looked down at his arm, where a vivid red mark was already blossoming, the imprint of 5 fingers. He looked up and into the pale, terrifyingly calm eyes of Silas. Silas hadn't shouted. He hadn't even made a sound. He stood between Malachi and the guard, his body a low, balanced shield. He hadn't just blocked the blow, he had intercepted the intent behind it. He held Malachi's arm in a grip that felt less like a hand and more like a mechanical vice, the pressure on the nerves sending jolts of agony up to his shoulder. The fight-or-flight instinct, so dominant in Malachi just seconds ago, was now paralyzed by sheer disbelief. This wasn't supposed to happen. People were supposed to be afraid. They were supposed to get out of his way. Around them, chaos erupted. The crowd surged back, a wave of screams and shouts. Women clutched their children. Men yelled in alarm. The police nearest to the scene began to push their way through, their faces a mask of shock and fury. The mounted guardsman, finally alerted by the commotion, reined in his horse, the animal snorting and sidestepping. He looked down, bewildered, at the scene below him. The fallen pipe, the furious young man held in the iron grip of a calm, older civilian. He had been seconds away from a catastrophic brain injury, and he didn't even know it. Malachi, his bravado crumbling into desperate rage, tried to yank his arm free. He was wiry and strong, full of the explosive energy of youth, but it was like trying to pull a tree stump out of the ground. Silas didn't budge. His feet were planted, his core tight. He used Malachi's own futile effort against him, subtly shifting his weight to unbalance the younger man, forcing him to stumble forward a step. He spoke then, his voice low and calm, a stark contrast to the screaming crowd. And it was the tone of a man who had commanded respect in far more terrifying situations. "It's over, son. Don't make it worse." The word son was like acid on Malachi's rage. "Get off me, old man!" he snarled, his spittle flying. He swung his free fist in a wild, clumsy hook aimed at Silas's head. It was a pathetic attempt, born of desperation and a complete lack of training. Silas didn't even flinch. He simply wasn't there anymore. He moved his head a fraction of an inch, letting the punch whistle past his ear. In the same fluid motion, he released Malachi's arm, but only to replace that grip with something far more debilitating. He deflected the exhausted punch with his forearm, then his hand shot out, not to strike but to control. He grabbed Malachi by the back of the neck, his thumb and fingers finding the pressure points at the base of his skull with anatomical precision. He exerted a gentle, inexorable pressure, forcing Malachi's head down and forward. To the onlookers, it looked almost gentle, like a father guiding a recalcitrant child. But to Malachi, it was a complete and utter shutdown. An incredible wave of dizziness washed over him. His knees buckled. All the fight, all the rage, simply drained out of him, replaced by a horrifying, helpless vulnerability. He was completely and totally under the control of this man. Silas held him there, bent over, facing the cobblestones, a perfect picture of submission. He wasn't trying to hurt him. He was simply demonstrating with devastating finality the unbridgeable gulf between a brawler and a trained professional. By now, the two uniformed police officers had fought their way through the crowd, their hands on their batons, their faces flushed with adrenaline. "Let him go! Step away!" one of them barked, his voice high and strained. Silas looked up at them, his expression unchanging. "He's all yours, officer," he said calmly. He then, with a deliberate slowness that spoke of absolute control, released his grip. Malachi slumped forward, catching himself on his hands, gasping for air, his entire body trembling. The police grabbed him, roughly pulling his arms behind his back and snapping on handcuffs. They read him his rights, but the words were lost in the noise of the crowd. Malachi, now just a subdued, terrified young man, offered no resistance. His eyes, wide and empty, searched for the man who had so effortlessly dismantled him. But Silas had already taken a step back, melting into the anonymity of the crowd as easily as he had emerged from it. The mounted guardsman, a young corporal named Evans, dismounted, his hands shaking slightly as a fellow officer steadied his horse. He walked over to Silas, his face a mixture of profound gratitude and utter confusion. "Sir, I don't know what to say. That man, he was going to—" He couldn't even finish the sentence. The reality of what had almost happened only just beginning to dawn on him. Silas gave him a small, almost imperceptible nod. "Just doing what needed to be done, son. You stay safe now." He patted the young man on his armored shoulder, a gesture of such simple, unassuming camaraderie that it brought a sudden, unexpected lump to Corporal Evans's throat. This man, a stranger, and had just saved him from a life-altering injury, possibly death, and he was acting as if he'd just helped an old lady cross the street. The police sergeant on the scene, a grizzled veteran himself, approached Silas. He had seen the whole thing from a distance. He had seen the speed, the precision, the absolute control. He knew a professional when he saw one. He stuck out his hand. "Name's Sergeant Cordell. That was some of the cleanest work I've ever seen. You military?" Silas shook his hand, his grip firm, but not crushing. "Was. A long time ago." "Well, was or not, you just saved one of my city's finest from a world of hurt. We're going to need a statement. The press is going to have a field day with this." Silas's jaw tightened, almost imperceptibly. It was the one thing he hadn't considered. The attention. Then the last thing he wanted was to be in the spotlight. But he nodded. It was part of the process. As Sergeant Cordell led him a few feet away to take his initial report, the crowd's energy had completely transformed. The fear was gone, replaced by a buzzing, excited curiosity. Whispers followed Silas. "Did you see that? That guy was incredible. He just took him apart." Cell phones were held aloft, capturing the aftermath, the police cruiser now pulling up to take Malachi away. Silas kept his head down, his answers to Cordell's questions short and factual. He just wanted to go home. The simple, happy memory his daughter had wanted for him had turned into something else entirely. It had become a reminder of who he really was, and of a duty that it seemed would never truly let him go. The initial chaos subsided as quickly as it had erupted. The police cruiser carrying a dazed and handcuffed Malachi disappeared down a side street, its siren giving a final forlorn whoop. The mounted guardsman, Corporal Evans, had been gently but firmly led away by his superiors, his pristine uniform a stark contrast to the turmoil on his young face. The ceremonial procession, after a brief, flustered halt, was rerouted, the monarch's safety paramount, the route now cleared of the sudden, shocking violence. But for the thousands of people who had witnessed it, the spectacle was far from over. Their attention had simply shifted from the distant, glittering pageant to the quiet, unassuming man in the center of it all. Silas stood where Sergeant Cordell had left him, a small island of calm in a sea of gawking faces, and he leaned against the very barrier he had, moments ago, vaulted over. His posture once again relaxed, but his pale eyes still held a flicker of their recent intensity. He felt exposed, a feeling he deeply disliked. Years of operating in the shadows, of being the unseen hand, had instilled in him a profound need for anonymity. Now, hundreds of phones were aimed in his direction, their lenses like 1,000 tiny, intrusive eyes. The whispers had grown into a low, constant murmur, a soundtrack of awe and speculation. A young woman, barely out of her teens, broke away from her friends and approached him hesitantly. Her eyes were wide with a mixture of fear and admiration. "Excuse me, sir?" she said, her voice trembling slightly. Silas looked at her, his expression softening almost imperceptibly. Yes, miss? I wanted to thank you. That man, he could have hurt that guard so badly. What you did, it was so brave. My dad was in the army, and he always said real heroes don't wear capes. She thrust a small notepad and a pen towards him. Could I have your autograph? My dad would never believe I met a real hero. Silas looked at the notepad, then back at the girl's earnest, hopeful face. He saw no malice in her, no thirst for sensationalism, just genuine, youthful gratitude. He let out a slow breath. He wasn't a hero. Heroes were the ones who didn't come back, the ones he'd left behind in the sand and the mud. He was just a man who had reacted on instinct. But he understood the need for symbols, for stories. It was part of what held the fabric of society together. He took the pen and the pad. He didn't sign his name, and he simply wrote, "Stay safe," and beneath it, the date. He handed it back to her. She looked at it, a little confused by the lack of a name, but clutched it to her chest as if it were a priceless treasure. "Thank you," she breathed, and hurried back to her friends, who immediately crowded around her to look. More people began to approach, emboldened by the girl's success. They weren't aggressive, just curious and grateful. A portly man in a business suit wanted to shake his hand, calling him a credit to the nation. A mother with 2 young children thanked him for making the city feel safer. A group of teenagers, the same age as the thug now on his way to jail, looked at him with a newfound respect, their usual swagger muted. Silas handled each one with a quiet, unassuming grace. He shook hands, nodded at thanks, and offered brief, non-committal replies. He didn't correct their assumptions or downplay his actions with false modesty. He simply accepted their gratitude as a representative of something larger than himself, the ideal of the citizen protector, the ordinary person who steps up in a crisis. Sergeant Cordell eventually returned, his notepad filled with scribbled notes. He had been interviewing other witnesses, piecing together the official account. He looked at the small crowd gathered respectfully around Silas and chuckled. "Looks like you've got a fan club, mister?" He left the question hanging. "Silas," the older man offered simply. "Mr. Silas. Well, the van is here to take you down to the station to give a formal statement. We can slip out the back way. Avoid most of this." He gestured with his head towards the main thoroughfare. That's where news vans were already beginning to arrive, their satellite dishes stretching skyward like metallic flowers. The story was already out, a juicy morsel for the 24-hour news cycle. Veteran thwarts attack on Royal Guard. Silas nodded, grateful for the offer of a quiet exit. He followed Cordell through a cordon of police officers who parted respectfully to let him pass. As he walked, he caught the eye of another veteran in the crowd, a man about his own age, wearing a faded cap from a different war. Their eyes met, and a look of profound, wordless understanding passed between them. It was a look that said, "I know. I know where that comes from. I know what it costs." The other man gave him a slow, deliberate nod of respect, a salute from one soldier to another, unconstrained by time or uniform. Silas returned the nod, and a simple acknowledgement of a shared, unspoken brotherhood. It was the first moment that day that had felt truly genuine. The ride to the police station was short and quiet. Cordell made small talk, but Silas was lost in his own thoughts. He thought about his daughter. He'd have to call her, explain why he wasn't going to be home for dinner. He could already imagine her reaction, a mixture of pride, fear, and that familiar, gentle exasperation. "I just wanted you to have a nice normal day out, Dad," she'd say. He almost smiled. Normal. He'd long ago given up on normal. At the station, the atmosphere was a strange blend of routine and excitement. The desk sergeant looked up with wide eyes as they entered, whispering to a colleague. Silas was led to an interview room, a bland beige space with a table and a few chairs. It was familiar territory. He'd been in rooms like this before, though usually on the other side of the table after an incident on patrol or during a debriefing. A younger detective, Detective Miller, was assigned to take his statement. He was keen, professional, but couldn't quite hide his awe. "Mr. Silas," he began, placing a recording device on the table. "Thank you for coming in. What you did out there today was extraordinary. I've reviewed the preliminary witness statements, and several people mentioned the speed and precision of your intervention. Can you walk me through exactly what happened? From the moment you first noticed the suspect?" Silas did. He spoke in a calm, measured tone, his account devoid of emotion or self-aggrandizement. He described seeing the man, noting his erratic movement and aggressive posture, and spotting the pipe, recognizing the threat, and reacting. He described his intervention with clinical detachment. "I moved to intercept. I neutralized his weapon arm. I secured him and waited for your officers to arrive." He made it sound as simple as making a cup of coffee. Detective Miller listened, fascinated. "You used some kind of hold on him. At the end, he just collapsed. It was incredibly effective and caused him no lasting injury. Where did you learn that?" "A different life. Detective," Silas said, his tone closing the subject. Miller got the hint and didn't push. The formalities took about an hour. They went over the details, clarified the timeline, and confirmed Silas's identification. When it was done, Miller shook his hand warmly. "You're free to go, Mr. Silas. And on behalf of the entire department, thank you. That young guardsman, Corporal Evans, he's at the hospital now. He's physically fine, just in shock. His family has been calling. They want to thank you personally. We gave them your information, if that's all right." Silas hesitated, then nodded. It would be churlish to refuse. As he walked out of the interview room, he was met by a sight that stopped him in his tracks. Standing in the main lobby of the police station, looking lost and slightly out of place, was an older woman. She was small and bird-like, with silver hair and kind, worried eyes. She was clutching a handkerchief. Behind her stood a man who could only be her husband, tall and stooped, his own face etched with anxiety. As soon as she saw Silas emerge from the corridor, her face crumpled. She rushed forward, and before Silas could react, she had grabbed his hands in her own, which were trembling violently. "Are you him?" she whispered, her voice thick with tears. "Are you the man who saved our Michael?" Silas looked down at her, then past her at the anxious father. He realized who they were. Corporal Evans's parents. He felt a sudden, unfamiliar tightness in his own chest. He gave a small, almost imperceptible nod. The woman let out a sob, a sound of pure, overwhelming relief. She squeezed his hands tighter. "My boy," she said, her voice breaking. "My baby boy. They told us what almost happened. They told us about the pipe. If you hadn't been there—" She couldn't finish. She just shook her head, tears streaming down her cheeks. His father stepped forward, his own eyes glistening. He was a solid working-class man, his handshake rough and strong. And he didn't say anything for a long moment. He just looked Silas in the eye, a world of gratitude in that simple gaze. Then he spoke, his voice gruff with emotion. "There ain't words," he said. "There just ain't words for what you did. You gave us back our son. We are in your debt, sir. Forever." He put a hand on his wife's shoulder, his own composure finally cracking as he pulled her gently away. Silas stood there, A man who had faced enemy fire without flinching, who had made life-and-death decisions in the blink of an eye, now rendered speechless by the raw, unfiltered gratitude of two ordinary parents. He simply nodded again, his throat too tight for words. He had never thought of his actions in those terms. He hadn't saved a guardsman. He had saved a son, a boy with a mother and a father who loved him, and the realization was a profound and humbling weight. The news of the parents' arrival and their emotional meeting with Silas spread through the station like wildfire. Officers who had seen it all paused and looked on with a new respect, not just for Silas's skill, but for the human consequence of his actions. As Silas finally made his way out of the station into the cool evening air, he felt a strange sense of peace settle over him. The unwanted attention, the flashing lights of the news cameras he could see staking out the front entrance, the inevitable hero label. None of it mattered as much anymore. He had seen the face of what he had truly protected. It was the face of a frightened mother, weeping with relief. And for a man who had seen so much ugliness, that was a memory worth holding on to. And the days that followed the incident transformed Silas's life in ways he could never have anticipated. The quiet, deliberate anonymity he had cultivated for 2 decades was shattered irrevocably and publicly. The story, as Sergeant Cordell had predicted, exploded. It was the perfect news cycle narrative, a sudden, shocking act of violence, a fearless, split-second intervention by an unassuming citizen, the revelation of his military past. News outlets, hungry for a hero in a cynical world, latched on to it. They camped outside his modest apartment building, their satellite trucks a permanent fixture on his quiet street. His phone, once used only for calls from his daughter and the occasional old army buddy, rang constantly with unknown numbers. Silas handled it all with the same stoic grace he had shown at the scene. That he gave no interviews. He made no statements. He simply retreated further into his shell, refusing to be drawn into the media circus. But his picture, captured on a dozen cell phones, was everywhere. The grainy image showed a man in mid-motion, his expression one of intense, focused calm, a stark contrast to the blurred panic of the crowd around him. He became a symbol, a meme, a Rorschach test for a nation's longing for quiet, effective heroism. They called him the Cobblestone Guardian and the Silent Sentry. He hated every single one of the names. His daughter, Claire, was a whirlwind of conflicting emotions. She was terrifically proud of him, of course, but also terrified by the spotlight and deeply worried about the toll it might take. She came to his apartment one evening, letting herself in with her key, to find him sitting in the dark, the only light the flickering blue glow of his muted television, which was showing his own grainy image. "Dad?" she said softly, sitting on the arm of his chair. He grunted in acknowledgement. "Are you okay? You're not answering your phone." "It's for the best," he said, his voice a low rumble. "Nothing good comes from talking to them." She looked at the TV. A news anchor was breathlessly recounting the story yet again, this time with a new expert analyst who was breaking down the tactical brilliance of his intervention. Claire felt a surge of protective anger. "They're making you into a cartoon character, Dad." He nodded slowly. "I know, but it'll pass. It always does. Something shinier will come along, and they'll forget all about me." He was right, of course. That was the nature of the news cycle. But before it passed, the story took one final, unexpected turn. A week after the incident, a large, official-looking envelope arrived at his apartment. It bore the royal crest. Claire was with him when he opened it. Inside was a formal, beautifully inscribed invitation. He and a guest were requested to attend a private ceremony at the palace, where he would be personally thanked by the monarch and presented with a civilian award for bravery. It was an honor of the highest order, the kind of thing most people only ever dreamed of. Claire gasped, "Dad, this is incredible." Silas looked at the elegant script, the heavy embossed paper. He thought of the young guardsman, Corporal Evans. He thought of his parents, weeping in the police station. And he thought of the young woman who had asked for his autograph. He thought of the other veteran who had nodded to him in the crowd. This wasn't about him. It was about all of them. It was about the idea that someone would step in, that the violence and chaos wouldn't be allowed to win. He realized, perhaps for the first time, that accepting this recognition wasn't an act of ego. It was an act of validation for that very idea. "I guess we'd better find you a dress," he said to Claire, a rare, small smile touching his lips. The day of the palace ceremony was crisp and clear, a perfect autumn afternoon. Claire, beautiful and nervous in a simple navy dress, walked beside her father as they approached the very gates where, just weeks before, the world had nearly changed for the worse. This time, they weren't part of the crowd, and they were ushered through by polite, discreet staff. Inside, the palace was a world of hushed elegance, of polished floors and magnificent art. They were led to a smaller, ornate reception room where a small group had gathered. Corporal Michael Evans was there, standing at attention in his dress uniform, looking young and impossibly smart. Beside him stood his parents, the mother dabbing at her eyes with a handkerchief even before the ceremony began. There were a few senior military officers, their chests heavy with medals, and several palace officials. When Silas entered, all eyes turned to him. Corporal Evans's face lit up with a mixture of relief and profound respect. He stepped forward, and to Silas's surprise, the young man saluted him, a sharp, perfect gesture. "Mr. Silas," he said, his voice steady but thick with emotion. I don't have the words. Thank you for my life." Silas returned the salute, an old habit, then extended his hand. "You just keep doing your duty, son. That's all the thanks I need." The ceremony itself was brief and surprisingly informal. The monarch, a figure of grace and quiet authority, spoke to each of them personally. When she came to Silas, she looked at him with keen, intelligent eyes. "Sergeant Major Silas," she said, using his old rank, a detail someone had clearly researched. "We owe you a great debt. You reminded us all that courage and duty are not confined to a uniform. They live in the hearts of our citizens." She pinned a small, elegant medal to his lapel. It was a simple thing, a silver cross on a ribbon, but it carried the weight of centuries of tradition. Silas, for once, was at a loss for words, and he simply bowed his head slightly. "It was my duty, ma'am," he said quietly. "It's all I knew to do." After the ceremony, there was a small reception. Silas found himself standing by a window, looking out over the vast manicured gardens, a glass of champagne untouched in his hand. The medal felt strange and heavy on his chest. Claire was nearby, chatting animatedly with a young aide-de-camp. Corporal Evans approached him, his parents hovering supportively behind him. The mother, Mrs. Evans, took Silas's hand. "We see you as family now, Mr. Silas," she said, her voice firm despite her tears. "You'll always be welcome in our home. For as long as we live, we will be grateful." Her husband clapped him on the shoulder, a solid, manly gesture that said everything words could not. For the second time, Silas felt that unfamiliar tightness in his chest. He looked at these three people, their lives forever intertwined with his by a single, violent moment. He saw the fear in the mother's eyes that would probably never fully leave, the pride in the father's, and the dawning maturity in the young corporal's. He had not just stopped an attack. He had preserved a family. As the reception wound down and they prepared to leave, Claire linked her arm through his. "Well, Dad," she said, her eyes shining. "How do you feel?" They walked out of the grand entrance and into the cool evening air. The palace gates were open now, and beyond them, he could see the ordinary life of the city going on. People were walking home from work, couples were strolling, a bus was rumbling past. The crowd from that day was gone. The chaos was a memory. And the cameras were elsewhere. Silas looked down at the medal on his chest, then up at the darkening sky. He thought of the young thug, Malachi, sitting in a cell somewhere, his moment of stupid, violent rage having cost him his freedom. He thought of the men he had lost, the ones who would never have the chance to stand in a palace and be thanked. He thought of the quiet satisfaction of a job done, not for glory, but simply because it was the right thing to do. He finally answered his daughter's question. He looked at her, his pale blue eyes clear and calm. "I feel like I'm ready to go home, Claire," he said. And for the first time in a very long time, he meant it. The duty was done. The lesson had been taught, and the quiet man, the veteran, the guardian, could finally rest. He put his arm around his daughter's shoulder, and together, they walked away from the palace, two ordinary people disappearing into the ordinary night, the weight of an extraordinary moment finally, peacefully lifted.